Just checking who's going to open the meeting. Okay. Hello, 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 everybody. All ready to go with the interpretation as well? Yes, brilliant. Okay, we can now formally begin. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. The University of Cologne is delighted to welcome back to our webinars. We've had a bit of a hiatus given the coronavirus pandemic, so we're delighted to be beginning our webinar series again. Today, we are absolutely delighted to warmly welcome Ronice Müller de Quadros. This is her sign name. Ronice is professor at a university in Brazil, which is the UFSC. I won't, the acronym is easier to pronounce than the full name itself. And she has been working as the director of the center there for a long time and has been focusing on sign language research. She's been studying children of deaf adults, hearing individuals who grow up and have sign language as their first language. She has documented their experiences as well as their use of sign language. The sign language in Brazil is Libras, and they have been developing the corpus of Libras, and Ronice has been instrumental in researching the data that has been collected there. So as I mentioned, we at the University of Cologne are absolutely delighted to welcome her here to speak this evening. However, before we formally begin and pass the floor over to Ronice, I just want to go over a couple of house rules. We will have the presentation, after which there will be a Q&A session. We kindly ask if you have any questions, please use the raise hand function. We will then enable your camera so that you are able to speak or sign your question. Please announce which language you will be using before you begin. This will enable interpreters to adapt accordingly. Okay? So I am now absolutely delighted to hand over to Ronice, and I'm very excited to see what she has to present this evening. Ronice is saying thank you very kindly, and to the team who have organized this at the University of Cologne. I am absolutely delighted to be here, and I hope this is a collaboration we can continue into the future. My presentation today really takes a look at language policies in Brazil. This is of particular interest as there's been a lot of occurrences and a lot of developments over the years that I want to take the time to present to you today. So at first, I will give you, oh, is it distracting in the back? Okay, just 30 seconds. I'm going to reposition myself. Okay. See, I'm not seeing what you have on the back of the screen here. Bear with us while we sort this out. Okay, I'm going to reshare my screen again in the hopes that it will work. There we go. That seems to be in line. Sorry about that technical glitch. Just getting communication from someone else across the room. Okay. Okay. Is that better? Are we okay to proceed? All good? Okay, perfect. Perfect. My apologies about the technical hindrances there. So today, what I'd like to illustrate in my presentation are language policies and the importance of language policies as they relate to language practices. This is something that wasn't done in isolation. It was a massive collaboration across spoken and sign languages, and it pertains to life. Language is a crucial part of life, be that signed or spoken, and sign language is necessary in order to socialize. Language policies support and are important. Around the world, across the globe, sign languages have in fact been declared as endangered. Whether the sign language itself is not accepted in society or as a system, it's not recognized, has caused for its endangerment as a language. And what we notice is deaf communities are not educated in their language. We're seeing deaf schools close. They're dwindling by the day. And this is problematic in terms of the longevity of sign language. How can it survive if it's not being used on a day-to-day basis? And language policy is a solution to this problem to protect and promote sign languages and ensure their longevity. Language policies that have been in place in various countries have developed over time, and they have developed to support sign languages. And in our case, in Brazil, that sign language is Libras, which is what we call Brazilian Sign Language. So that's how I will be referring to it throughout this presentation, as Libras. As I'm sure you're aware, Brazil is a huge country. Huge. It has 27 states across its nation. I'm only going to give you a glimpse of one state, but the size of that state is the same size as Germany as a whole country. So imagine 27 states, and the one I'm exploring is the size of the nation of Germany. That is just to illustrate the enormity of Brazil. Our population, as you can see, is 230 million people. And from that population, there are approximately 9 million deaf and hard of hearing people across Brazil. In terms of the number, it's from government statistics, and that statistical collection includes deafness at all levels, not necessarily deaf sign language individuals, but in terms of deaf signing people, we approximate it to be about 3 million people, which is still a considerable number of people who use sign language in Brazil. Brazil is linguistically very diverse and rich. There are many languages, but the official language is Portuguese. But bear in mind that there are many other, more than 200 languages due to immigration and indigenous languages. So there are many, but the official language is Portuguese. But it's important to bear in mind that we are a linguistically diverse nation. Approximately 200 different languages are used in Brazil, including indigenous languages. Libras, Brazilian Sign Language, is used throughout Brazil. There are other minority sign language communities, but they must learn Libras as the language, the national sign language of Brazil. So it is the national sign language. What I'm going to do now is give you a broader picture of the policies pertaining to Libras in Brazil over the years. As I mentioned, this was a long process that first began in early 2000s with this first law you can see here, Law 10436, and this was the formal recognition of Libras as a national language. So this was essential for deaf communities across Brazil as it garnered recognition of their language, and this took place in 2002. So this gave formal recognition to Libras. As you see, then in 2005, there was a decree, which doesn't hold the same weight as a law, but it did decree language planning for Libras. It kind of manifested in more detail and in practical ways how you could implement the law recognizing Libras back in 2002. It was a supporting decree to ensure the practical elements of recognizing Libras, and that took place in 2005. It's a crucial piece of legislation that, as it says many aspects that are necessary, and there is much decreed in it to ensure Libras. Just as an example, as you're here this evening, the reason we're here today is a direct knock-on effect of this decree back in 2005. So then from 2005 to 2014, we move on again. And again, this is another important and crucial piece of legislation, as it's a law that is nationally binding. And what it was a national plan of education from 2014 that would build education for deaf individuals that would be bilingual. These initial 3 laws, we had others that were short and didn't mention that have elements pertaining to Libras, but these 3 are stronger pieces of legislation, and they're crucial to how we have come to be in Brazil. We have Brazilian Sign Language recognized as a right. And what this has done is it has facilitated sign language research and built that field as a whole.
An important aspect that I want to focus on is how Libras actually got legitimized and recognized by the Brazilian government in terms of policy is by the organization called Ronice. And this is a deaf organization, a consortium of various organizations that join this structure and compromises of all Brazilian deaf people and is representative as a global, regional representative. All of these deaf organizations have strong deaf leaders, making sure that there's advocacy happening, making sure that there's motivational talks and understanding of deaf people and the improvement of the lives of deaf people. And to organize for better access for deaf people as well. And for the formal recognition of Libras. So this is what the organization stands for. Ronice plays a critical role in the support of recognition of Libras as a language by the government. They advocated with the government to ensure that there's recognition, and this advocacy did not happen overnight. It was a long process. These various organizations have planned marches, planned protests to be visible, to ensure that people understand the recognition or the need for recognition of Libras. This was the most important thing. I want you to remember that this is important, and the work that has been done in conjunction with academia. So taking a look now at the legitimacy of Libras concerning law. As I've mentioned before, Libras has been recognized in conjunction with academics and academia at the university, where research was being conducted on Libras to understand how Libras is being documented, understanding Libras in an educational environment, what it means in a linguistic environment. And then Ronice partnered with these various associations to ensure that our work is not done in isolation, but done with Ronice. And this was a great success and ensured greater development for Libras. So Ronice and academia worked in conjunction to ensure there are definitely empowerment of deaf people on PhD level, to ensure that there's equal participation and development of Libras in Brazil. So looking at this slide, academia has produced many documentation, has published many books and literature to ensure that there is legitimacy of Libras being recognized. So over the years since 2002, when the law was ratified in the country, there was so much production of these academic resources. So now back to the question, you might ask yourself, how did we implement these language policies? How did it come to be recognized? Once it was recognized, it was not just placed on the shelf. We actually had continuous engagements to see how it is possible to create more awareness, more structure, more documentation for the development of Libras. So the very first historic milestone for Libras was that the law was recognized in education, in higher education specifically, in the universities. And so we started in 2005 by admitting new students and having Libras as a language of education and training. Letras de Libras within the university. And you might ask yourself, why was this the case? It is important to have sign language within the language composition of the universities. So this was not involved only in education. We taught in the educational sphere, but we also had a special arrangement in special needs education. We diverted this to a language of equality, where they can have it as in vocational language, for example, in DGS, in Spanish, in Portuguese. All of these languages was recognized on an equal level. So this is the importance. We wanted languages to be equal when we started this program in 2005 until 2001. So looking further at the university, when we set up this program at UFSC, when we started looking at these policies, we did not have interpreter training as yet. We first engaged by thinking of having deaf people who have already been trained, but does not have a degree as yet. We looked at those participants. And then we started setting up a program, which was the very first focus on deaf people. Once that was concluded, we then had our first group of 450 students. And all of those students were deaf, but they could sign. So this was the access that was provided for graduate students at the university. It was taught at the same level of a BA degree. And so these deaf students could then study to become teachers themselves. They were already teachers, but they did not have a degree, a formal education. And then in 2001, in 2016, we then started making sure that we have equality of education, where we have hearing students coming in, for example, if they teach English or French or German, wherever they go, that where they get their degree so that they do have some kind of access. So this was the start of our program, where Libras actually became an official language taught within the university. It was part of a degree program. So this was possible within the universities within Brazil. Following on that achievement, we then had 5 other states where we looked at the progress on how this evolved. It is important to mention that the policy enabled the effect of making sure that the language is recognized within higher education. And this enabled us to get more scope and to go further. In 2020, we then had 1,200 deaf students who then got into the Libras program, became teachers. We also started in 2018, which is after that program, to divert a bit into a graduate program for interpreters and translators. So this is a new program that we took on that went into spoken Portuguese and then Libras. So these are the 2 language combinations we had. So firstly, there was the program where they had to learn Libras, get their degrees. And then the second part, we focused on navigating into the aspect of getting graduate programs in interpreting and translation to develop professional interpreters in this program. So this has been our offerings thus far. So the biggest social impact that we've seen by establishing this program in a higher education context is the equality of Libras. And we can see the importance of these achievements. I will now focus on the empowerment of deaf people with education, looking at deaf students at universities, accessing higher education, not only by signing alone, but also important to realize that there are other university programs, other graduate programs, and degree options that deaf people can choose from within the universities. Previously, in 2002, we had deaf people accessing the university, and we had 345 deaf people. Now you can see a steady increase from the first time, and we've collected this data, and the number that you see in 2019 is that there's been a massive increase with 9,282 deaf students that have actually accessed these various career paths or study paths in the university. So deaf people are able to access university and follow their preferred choice of study through the recognition of Libras, which made this possible. And not only the interpreting program, but other study areas as well from different universities. The slide that I want to focus on now is looking at deaf people who has been through the university system, who has graduated, and all of them finding employment later on or in various sectors. So they would be professors, researchers, teachers. Some would work, on an MA level or a PhD level, and they would find various aspects of employment within the university and across. Currently, we have 400 deaf professors, and it's within my university, and we are on equal par with other universities in the higher education sphere. We also have another category. Just hold on, I need to check my screen. We have hearing professors who are balanced bilinguals, and they too work in the university, in the Department of Libras, focusing on this teaching. We have set up the program in the whole of Brazil in various universities. This program has been recognized. And so in the schools, we have then looked for employment, and they've gained employment in the schools to be teachers. We have 3,000 bilingual teachers in schools for the deaf, who both sign and who speak spoken Portuguese. The next point is we have sign language interpreters, and there's so many of them. Right now, the data indicates that we have more than 4,438 sign language interpreters placed in various locations within schools for the deaf, within public service departments and universities, higher education settings. And they are full-time employed. At my university, UFSC, we do have 11 interpreters employed in the university full-time to ensure that there's interpreting services and access for deaf people to satisfy the need. This obviously is not enough. The number will never be sufficient because there are so many deaf students in my university as well. We have 13 deaf professors. We have full-time workers in my university within UFSC. And so interpreters are deployed to interpret meetings and to accompany deaf people to provide access.
So what I hope you can see on the slide here are the images of all our PhD graduates. Too many to name. And they all are fully employed. They have completed their PhD, graduated, and full-time positions in Brazil. Who knows what they'll be able to attain in the future with their success and their expertise. But I just wanted to show in this image how many PhD graduates we have, all of whom are deaf. It's important, though, to show that this didn't come of nothing. This was a slow progress from our language policies that led to the empowerment of deaf people. And now they are at a level where they are of equal status to every other person. And it's a drastic change. It's easy for deaf individuals to be inducted and brought into university. And we know that university work is not easy. Frequently, we see in other countries that it's a single deaf person facing many obstacles, fighting for their interpretation, incredibly burdensome for them. But this is not the case that we've experienced here. We fought very hard from the outset to encourage and foster this space, this deaf space. So what we will see shortly is that we have, my apologies, we have 82 deaf PhD candidate students, and they are all working. So what happens is they achieve their position as PhD, and then the university asked, okay, well, if you have, once you've completed your PhD, we ask you to complete your PhD so that you can come work with us in our company. But what has happened with many companies is they have accepted those who've completed university at an MA level, MSc level, because there were not enough PhD candidates or those successful in completing their PhD. There were not even enough applying. So back in the day, there were fewer places wherein one could attain a PhD, but that's changed drastically now. And it is not only our UFSC that provides PhD programs, there are now many, many more through Libras and Portuguese. So it's developing across the country, which is, as you could see, enlarging the amount of PhD, deaf PhD graduates, as you could tell from this chart. If you take a look at this chart here, this is only the MA and PhD graduates from UFSC. Only, this is a snapshot from our university, but there are a numerous amount of other programs and other universities that provide this level of education for deaf sign language users. So this, again, these statistics are from 2008 to present, and it's the MA and PhD graduates. And as you can see, it's been a drastic increase. And now with the creation of other programs across Brazil, we're seeing the diversification. We're seeing people achieve PhD programs within other universities. And there's more peer support across PhD candidates and PhD graduates, which is really lovely to see. It's a really collaborative and warm research situation that a lot of people find them in, whether it's linguistics or translation and interpreting practices, which are the two we provide here in UFSCE. In other universities, there are MA and PhD programs for teaching, pedagogy, and so on, but we predominantly focus on interpreting, translation, and linguistics. It's been fascinating to watch the development, right? Because as sign language has built and developed, we see that hearing society and hearing researchers are also starting to include Libras in their language faculty. In their research, they're now considering Libras. And this is not just in UFSCE, this is again across Brazil. But this is what I've highlighted here in this image. I know it's a little bit challenging to see, but Libras is starting to crop up in all forms of language and linguistic research, which is amazing to see that they're not focusing on Libras as their main point or focus of study, but they are considering it, and it is viewed as a language, which is a huge step. In larger society as well, we're also seeing journals, media, any information, publications for the general public that are not academically inclined. We see that Libras is also mentioned at the same level as Portuguese and other languages. This person who works as part of the airport mentioned that I mentioned that I was starting to plan my work. And this person who worked as part of airport as a flight attendant, as part of cabin crew, mentioned that he moved to Sao Paulo and started to study French, Spanish, and Libras. That's huge. That really reflects the societal perspective, the societal view that is growing, that Libras is equivalent to any other language. So this work really we see has taken off and has been accepted by wider society. And this began with Letras Libras and the work that we've done. You know, as our graduates have grown, as our research has grown, we have seen that start to impact and infiltrate the views of society. And we're seeing more and more on a daily basis that Libras is recognized at the same level as other languages. Like I mentioned, when it comes to language policy and promoting linguistic rights, it can't be done in isolation. We need to ensure that Portuguese cannot be an exclusion factor, because we can see that in many situations, it's just Portuguese written or information is only accessible in Portuguese. And that creates and puts in place a lot of barriers for those who are non-native Portuguese users. And there's repetitive loss of information and exclusion from society. There is a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, a lot of information out there. And from the language policy recognizing Libras, information is starting to be more accessible in Libras, but it needs still to be available more for all deaf people in different spaces. Materials, information, all must be available in Libras. It has to be available as a right of deaf people in Brazil across all sectors, not necessarily academia. I'm talking in, culture and leisure life as well. Now, we have seen an improvement, but more could be done. Equally, deaf individuals who use Libras should have the right to use their language at any given point at any given time, under examination, under assessment, they should have the right to be able to record and film their work or any aspect of their life. They should be able to record their positions in Libras. I think that would make a huge impact to the deaf community. They could feel, okay, well, I'm actually a part of Brazil. This is my country. That would be a really big barrier to eliminate. Equally, deaf people have the right, same as their hearing peers. We know that they are being empowered. We know that they are achieving high educational status. A lot has changed in a relatively short period of time. As we know, there's often this stigma against sign language users or deaf people, that they are looked down upon. But now, with the amount of graduates we have coming from MA and PhD programs, we're seeing that they're coming to equal with their peers and sometimes surpassing their peers. You know, they have the right to show their knowledge in Libras and contribute to the conversation. And we have seen that contribution and the impact it has had. And this, again, I can't stress enough how much this has come back to the language policy, recognizing Libras. That has given deaf people the capacity to converse and be a part of conversation in their own language. And again, we're seeing it more and more and more as time passes. With new laws that are passing, like at the moment, there's a bill under discussion in the Brazilian government. And this law would represent deaf academics. Deaf academics are supporting this bill and are a huge part of the conversation that's taking place. So they are actively contributing to a law that will, in most likelihood, will pass. And that empowerment and that space where they can talk about information at this level comes from the language policy that came in back in 2002. So they have the right to show their knowledge in Libras and stand and make their point. Deaf children, they have the right to acquire sign language as their first language. Now, this is not perfect as of yet in Brazil, but this new law that is under discussion will be a significant step towards progressing this point. With our protagonists, our deaf people representing in these spaces, it'll hopefully progress this further. So as I've tried to demonstrate throughout, there is this cycle. Nothing works in isolation. It all is connected across the board. So as we see, we have the language policy, the planning, we have the education. You can see how in this graph, how all of this is interconnected. And now it has led to other sciences being involved as well.
So looking at the next slide and looking at the documentation of Libras to get an inventory of what Libras is about, we look at the various signs that we have. We have various aspects, and I'm unable to show you this in completion. But what we do have is language policy, which dominates this research. Research is imperative to support the foundation of Libras, to ensure that there's strength in proving empirical evidence of the linguistics of Libras, so that there's acceptance. If there are no research, there's this back and forth about, is this a real language? There's no strong foundation, and we all know this. And so it is important that there's always been this important relationship with the Deaf Association, the Deaf Consortium, and academia side by side, joining forces to ensure that societal views, so that the society as well as academia can empower each other to see the progression of Libras in various states. So we have done research on these various components, as you can see on the slide, to ensure that there's empowerment of deaf people, and language policy is informed by these various aspects of research. And language acquisition per se is also very important. Another aspect which is important that we need to consider in Libras is the recognition that there's equal recognition. And we do have a corpus for Libras. This means that we have research that documents different signs, that we produce various materials to show that we do have Libras as a language. These concepts are very important. I also need to then inform you that very soon, I'm very excited about this, we will be launching the Portal of Libras. It's coming very soon. In about 2 to 3 weeks' time, we will be able to broadcast this. The portal's goal is really around making sure that there's a central kind of depository to ensure that there's various different signs in Libras and various contributions can be made to this depository. There are also various research on linguistics, on poems, poetry aspects within Libras, and hand festivals, ensuring that all of these aspects of Libras, the beauty of it all is being incorporated in the depository. And so to ensure the different levels of education within schools are also documented and deposited into this portal. It is also then important to ensure that Libras are being seen by other people. And the most important critical point that I want to bring across is that this is a central depository where we can collect all the signs and the various aspects of Libras and save the language. So we can say, like, we can draw materials from a specific folder so that we can teach in a class, for example, if I'm a teacher, or use these various aspects to match whatever it is that we want to portray Libras as. We also have written Portuguese that is being documented. And this is to ensure that various people understand and can contribute and add the various signs and that they have. This is an open source portal. Everyone can contribute to it. It's not very closed. We ask the public to please contribute to this portal. Any new signs that you come across or research that you do have, because Brazil is very vast and we see developments on different phases. And so we would like to document all of these developments within one single place, which is the Portal Libras, where we can document what we have. And I'm very excited about this development. We will, as I said, soon make sure that you are able to access this portal. We are managing this portal as part of research, but it's increasingly important more that this is accessible by teachers for the deaf. So deaf learners get a quality education in terms of Libras and the level of education that they have. So I really do hope that you participate and contribute to this portal. This also contributes to language policy, because the more we disseminate this information, the more empowering it is for Libras, for future reference. You get what I'm saying. So this is just a snapshot on how to navigate the portal. We have various modules. Firstly, we have materials. Then we have courses, like different classes, where teachers have different levels of education. For example, when you're teaching Libras, you can add your signs in the different modules where you want to, where you have a contribution to make. So even at university level, there's also an aspect of higher education. When you have an MA or a PhD, you are able to contribute to that module. Next, we have research. And the very last one is an interactive space where people can actually socialize and have social language contribution. So this is how it will look, and it will be launched very soon. In the portal, we have various modules, as I said, various tabs. And so we as researchers work, for example, we work on grammar, and where we document different signs and have signed videos, signed resources. And this will give you an idea of how many hours. We have 8 8-hour videos that are sorted and analyzed so that you can view, and you could also download these to show to maybe to the students in class or whatever resource you want to use. Secondly, we have research that goes into Libras. For example, if you do accept that a person gets recorded to contribute to the corpus, they can also upload this there. This is to ensure that people around Brazil can further their work and contribute. The corpus has various aspects that features on linguistics. We then go on to the teaching of Libras, and this corpus specifically, as I said, is important. The goal of it is to make sure that we have various materials like poems and stories that can be added to this corpus that makes it more pleasurable to look at. Next, as I said, we have research, and we have various aspects included in this portal. The corpus of the Libras project has different kind of aspects. We look at it to inform language policy, how to improve Libras to inform language policy. And so to achieve this, we have various aspects of linguistics that we focus on. We focus on grammar within the whole of Brazil. We collect these documentation, we collect stories, and the same like I think you have in German, and you collect these stories in DGS. Brazil is much more vast. And so we have 50 states all around and 27 states all around. And we collected this information from these various states. So looking then into feeding language policies through the national inventory of Libras, looking at linguistics specifically, this is a crucial aspect to ensure that there's an inventory and collection of sign languages in Libras. The idea is to have, sorry, I'm jumping the gun. I need to move on my presentation because I'm running short of time. Let me just check how far I am from the last slide. I think I need to move on swiftly to conclusions because I'm running out of time. As you can see, in Brazil, there's been great empowerment and development of Libras and deaf people in particular. Deaf people have improved and excelled in various aspects in life. They are fully empowered. Not only in one place, it's not centralized, it's in the whole of Brazil, from the north to the south, covering all corners of Brazil. We have seen deaf people being empowered and finding employment. We have set up Libras in 27 states, and in all of the states, it is recognized. It is also important to know that in academia, deaf professors have excelled, and we have documentation and research within Libras. It's not only within UFSC, but also in other universities where we have partnerships and we work hand in hand with each other. More importantly, we have various graduates, deaf assistant professors graduating in PhD and attaining the highest level of education, obtaining their PhD. Thus far, we have 200 PhDs that will graduate in 2030. This is an estimated amount who will graduate in PhD. Yeah. So when they start their MA, sorry, just backtracking. When they start their PhD, you know, they get, if we count the various PhDs altogether, they make up 200. I also need to share that in all the 27 states, all the PhD students that graduate, both the deaf and the hearing graduates, are researchers, and all of these researchers develop the resources, and they cover various aspects of Libras in various contexts. It's not just in one specific line, for example, they cover various aspects, and there's a great support for Libras to enable more awareness and empowerment of the language, and it has grown from strength to strength. So once we have set up this portal, you'll be able to go into the web, and it will be a central depository to be able to increase the support for Libras and to have a central location where there can be a learning site, a sharing site, a research site, as well as just materials for the education of deaf learners within schools for the deaf. I think this is a critical development for the future of deaf children to ensure that we build better forward. I also think that the portal will be available for all to share. Libras is also important for deaf communities in the Brazilian context, because it requires more research. It promises a better life for all, and it ensures that there's involvement in the community. There's also a stronger network created among Brazilian researchers, with all the various professionals engaging with each other, having support for each other, building a community of practice, making sure that they actually support each other. So we have various groups. It's not only deaf academics that have a conversation. We also have hearing people involved in the development of Libras. And this is just a very humble achievement that we have. Next, establishing Libras as a language was done throughout Brazil in all the 27 states, and the impact was the improvement of informing language policy throughout Brazil and in other states to engage with what we have right now. So this is like one example, what we have with Germany, and this is nice.
My hope is that we will have more involved in language research, and I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. Well done. Thank you so much, Ronice, for your fantastic presentation. Now what I'll do is I will open the floor to any questions or comments that people may have. So the floor is for you. Again, I'd like to remind you to use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to signify that you have a question. Oh, are people a little bit shy? Don't worry, this is an incredibly safe space. Sorry, Leona, Ronice is saying I can't see. Are there any questions? Have we got any yet? No. Oh, okay. I'm just going to turn off my presentation to make things easier. Oh, I'm seeing there's a question from Jana Hausmann. Ronice is saying, now I can see. Ah. Now we can see. It's so funny. Ronice is saying, because I can see you here in Cologne, just there across the room. I find it very difficult to keep my attention on the screen when you're here in the room. The question will be asked in DGS. First of all, Ronice, I'd like to thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. It really got my brain active and working. My question is actually around students who are in the universities in Brazil. Are there rules, regulations that have to be complied with so the students can enter university? Because here in Germany, there are entrance exams. So for example, there are requirements that you have to complete, such as a high school diploma, And this can obviously cause some barriers for deaf students who are looking to enter university. They have to first complete high school diplomas before they enter university here in Germany. So I'm just wondering, is that the case in Brazil? And Ronice is responding, that is a very good question. So in Brazil, in my university in UFSC, we were the first, right? So we were the first to allow deaf students come in, and our only requirement was for them to complete a test. And it was simple things, testing their mathematical skills, their common knowledge, these basic tests that often are used to calculate your learning through life. Once you've completed this entrance exam, then you can enter the UFSC here. So before UFSC, you used to have a test, but it was all written. So you would have to read and then answer via multiple answers, A, B, C, D, take your pick. UFSC really revolutionized the whole system. It was the same test that all candidates had to take. But the only difference was it was all in Libras. So students had a computer, a laptop, and what would happen is they would have also the text in Portuguese to hand, but there was a computer with a video with all questions in Libras. So what it meant was candidates could watch this and then respond. They could also refer to the text if they wanted and then answer the questions. So remember, we were the first to establish this. And from this, we learned that these videos, in terms of watching, they tend to repeat watch the questions once or twice. And if you think about it from the hearing perspective, it tends to be you read the question quickly, but you can also read the question if you needed and if time was available, and then answer the question. For the videos in Libras, we noticed the same trend, but what we also noticed was it took more time. Deaf individuals needed more time and were allocated more time for this test than hearing equivalents who were taking the test in Portuguese, which would on average take 3 to 4 hours. For deaf candidates, it could take up to 6 hours to complete this. So we had to allocate more time to facilitate the need to rewatch these videos in Libras. So that began, as I said, in 2016, and then 2006, 2016, and then 2010. So that was 2006. 2010, we revamped the whole system. And then funnily enough, the Brazilian government decided to make this a standard to test this way. We were made an example of. UFSC, remember, previous to us, there was no way to do it. We made these adaptations, and what happened was the government decided to make a national university entrance exam, but following our regime that we had created. Now, this was the fruit of much debate, much lobbying, and formally came into place in 2014. That was the first time the government created this. So it really made an impact. And the reason for that was the test was for everyone, for all universities. So it meant that it wasn't only available in Portuguese because of our efforts and our work and essentially our unintentional piloting. Everything was available and ready to go and implement in Libras. So any university entrance exam that any university that a deaf individual wanted to apply to could enter and complete their entrance exam in Libras. And this has resulted in so many deaf individuals being in many programs across Brazil now. And not only in deaf-related subjects, there's computer engineering, there's many STEM subjects, which back before any of this happened was unthinkable. The fact that we are where we are now and that this entrance exam is a national mandate and is available in Libras is an incredible success. It used to be that it was only in Portuguese, which of course created an obstacle for deaf individuals, but that's not the case anymore. Anyone can apply to university on equal par to their peers. So we have definitely achieved equality in that sense. Once someone has been admitted to university, of course, there are differences. So we at UFSC, we offer an interpreting program, and we offer, interpreters in sign. So if an individual chooses to access material via sign, an interpreter will be enlisted, or maybe if there are language barriers, we facilitate and accommodate the individual to ensure their success and graduate the program, if you understand what I mean. But as you know, diversity is a big part of it, and there are still many people who experience barriers in attaining access to third level institutions, but it is getting better day by day. Thank you, Jana, saying thank you. Leona is saying, can I take advantage of the situation to ask a question? Will you be using IS? Yes, I will be using international sign. It actually ties into the question Jana asked. If a deaf individual completes this entrance exam watching these videos and respond, do they respond by checking the boxes, or do they sign their response? And if they have to give a lengthy response, do they then film themselves responding? Again, this is down to the candidate's preference. You are able to do either. You can write or you can sign. But it does depend, of course. If for Letras Libras, we request that all people respond in sign as it pertains to the subject that they want to do, like it involves Libras. But in other programs, that might not be the case. It might not be a mandate. But for the most part, I have seen most people sign, although there have been those who have checked the boxes. What I'm seeing from looking at things is that often they'll write their answer down, then review the video, and then rewrite their answer. So they use both languages. Any other questions from our audience? Dana, who's saying hello and asking what language. DGS. Okay. Just sorting out language combinations. I arrived a little bit late, but nonetheless, I have a question I want to ask. First of all, I have to say your presentation was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And it was fascinating to see Libras as a language and the number of university graduates there are and how they are bilingual using Libras and Portuguese. It's interesting because there are deaf individuals who want to partake in science subjects at university, like STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and they often have to bring in interpreters in order to access information. And while your course is, like, I appreciate it's in sign language, but obviously you don't have teachers teaching in sciences, or you do, or are interpreters used to facilitate these kind of classes. So as I mentioned, we had this program, the government initiated this national wide entrance exam to universities. And this test really shifted perspective on Libras. Now, what we see is that every single year, there are candidates applying to university requesting and using Libras. And we're seeing that as choice is available, more deaf people are choosing to go into science and engineering subjects, whether that's computer science or, I don't know, engineering. We're seeing more and more and more go into STEM subjects, which, as we know, is incredibly broad. It's also historical because that never happened before the recognition of Libras and where we've come to today. So as that has developed and more deaf people have gone into that field, we see that more Libras and more information accessible in Libras is being facilitated. And that is really coming from 2014 when that national test was implemented. and available in Libras. And Dana is just saying, so those who are finishing their MA and their PhD, what do they go on to work as? Is it in the field related to their study or beyond that? And talking about 2014 till 2021, that's 7 years. So what choice has been made available to these people? Before 2014, we saw many deaf individuals go into the field of education. Now and then it was linguistics and language research. Then deaf interpreting and translation we're seeing much more of, because materials were needed to be produced in Libras. There was a huge demand and request there. So that created opportunity for those who were bilingual, who had great understanding of Portuguese, could then interpret that into Libras and make materials available in an accessible manner for Libras users. Now we're seeing the sciences be taken over, particularly mathematics, computer science, and some engineers, 1 or 2, not many, but it's still developing. It's very interesting, and much more, all the congratulations, and here's to your continued success. Any other questions Leona's asking? No more questions, Ronice is asking? We have one from Jan Eichler. Hello, which language will you be using today? I can go either, but I think for today I'll use German Sign Language DGS. Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you so much for your presentation. I've really been considering some aspects that you've brought up in your presentation. As you mentioned, you have this Language Recognition Act in 2002, which really was the beginning of this legislation wave that brought you to where you were in 2014, that developed, educational programs that really brought Libras to another level and even got its societal recognition. In Germany, we also had DGS recognized in 2002, but not to the same degree of success. I mean, we've struggled to really progress DGS further, and I'm just wondering why that might be the case. We have lobbied, we have advocated our rights, but it's still, in comparison to Libras, we're still struggling to garner any movement and any change. We keep coming against blockades. I appreciate Brazil versus Europe is a very difficult comparison to make, but still we fought incredibly hard. And I know you guys fought incredibly hard to get your recognition in 2002, so much so that the success you garnered after is phenomenal. And we fought really hard to get to where we are, but we haven't been able to make any sort of waves in the same way you have. We recognize that sign language is part of our identity, it's part of our culture, and we are proud and we have deaf pride. Just then taking a look at universities and how they educate students, I mean, it often comes from university settings that deaf people start to recognize their pride. And I'm wondering, maybe, is that the same? That, the information is expanded upon in a way they understand that helps them foster the sense of deaf pride?
So maybe to give some context to the timeline, since its recognition in 2002, we have worked strongly with the Deaf Consortium. Since 1982, we've worked with the Deaf Consortium, FACEUS, with a strong collaboration with deaf communities around Brazil in advocating. And this was the start, really, of awareness raising of Libras as a language. So to make sure that it was recognized as an equivalent as spoken languages and not seen as gestures. So there was this big advocacy, and that timeline was quite long that we followed. Working with FACEUS also involved looking for collaboration with universities and academia to support the education, deaf education, and to try for awareness raising. So FACEUS really took the lead in this recognition. Academia was really secondary in making sure that there was recognition. There were really very few research available in linguistics on Libras, and we didn't really know what the impact was. And so it became imperative to have strong deaf connections and associations, and Brazilian associations for the deaf are really empowered and strong. If you can see an example of the States, they don't really have strong deaf associations all over. There's many of them closing down, but in Brazil, they've really shown resilience and progressed through the years, making sure that there's awareness. And so we've seen some change and more involvement at higher education institutions, making sure that there's more empowerment and visibility of Libras and the associations of the deaf. This has been an emphasis to support the empowerment and the development of Libras. There's also been much more advocacy done on ensuring that deaf associations gets involved in various platforms, for example, having lectures, showing up at associations, making sure that there is accessibility on most platforms. For example, our university has also joined forces with various partnerships to ensure that we have engagements in collaboration with everyone else. A critical aspect that I need to highlight is the idea of that there was no centralized focus of development of Libras. The bigger impact was realized because it was broadly advocated for throughout the Brazilian states. So change cannot happen in one place. Change increases and develop more when we have it in more areas of Brazil. And so the uptake of Libras and ensuring that there's awareness happened through the support of the various states. It would not have been possible without the strong network and the support of various organizations and partnerships. It was not easy to establish this network because of the vastness and the various engagements that we need to have. And there was not always agreement, but we advocated, and the process of advocacy brought us to having Libras recognized in the 27 states. Going forward, maybe to look at European context, well, what I do observe is that within Europe, maybe you need to link more to the education sector. And the reason why I'm saying this is that when we started working, were we involved in the education sector, if you don't put your foot in first, that's the most difficult sector that you can get into. And I don't know why it's a difficult sector, but this is just the way it is, you know. If you don't make an impact within education, this is where the problem lies. In Brazil, this was also the case, where we had to struggle because they still view deafness as a disability according to the medical model. You know, they link this education to special needs education. It's been functioning in that sector. And so we need to establish this link to ensure that Libras is recognized and deaf education is also recognized, to ensure that sign languages develop within the language faculties. And then we need to focus on education. It's just a snowball effect. And there's much more engagement that takes place. It's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a very hard and tough discussion that must be had, but this is what is needed. I feel that, you know, looking at what we see on how people see disability, and how hearing people see deafness, they see it as a disability. So this is a tough concept to change. It's not only one aspect. We need to look at various aspects. Maybe what is different in Germany is that, you've had the education sector covered, and this could be a problem. Maybe you need to look at other aspects, other fields to look into what needs to happen. Thank you so much for responding to the question. Leona speaking. So one person has sent me the question, and I will now read this question. The person's name is Fred. The question is being posed to Ronice. Brazil has set up their systems, on a political level, and the policy has been developed. What are the kind of obstacles that you faced in that regard? Yeah, this point is important. I should just make that in 2002, and this is way back, our president had ratified and formalized Libras, recognizing it as an official sign language in the whole of Brazil. The president endorsed this, and then the decree was passed in 2005. And right now, what we do have, okay, let me backtrack a bit. So I said that we have passed this law in education, and this was recognized as bilingual education, both Portuguese and Libras. The president has made sure that this is ratified. Then the third milestone that we've reached was, in the years progressing, there was no ratification by the presidency. But FACES, the Deaf Consortium, has been advocating with academia to ensure that this bill is passed, and that it can actually become an official legal instrument, an official law in the country, so that deaf children have the right to be educated in schools and receive a bilingual education, both in written Portuguese and Libras. And this was an important step that we've been advocating for since the beginning of time. So once this law is passed, we hope in future that it will be passed. And so this would mean that we keep on advocating with a specific president to ensure that we have political will to develop Libras. And this is not an overnight process. It's step by step that we have to go on. And in various states, we need to then advocate for the recognition. Well, I know that, there's various aspects and various processes that law needs to be passed. And well, it doesn't matter, but what we need to, what is important for us is that we need to ensure that we vote for lawmakers to ensure that there are political will, to ensure that in future these bills are approved. And the president wants this law is then passed to make sure that there's a pathway established to ensure that this law is implemented. If you have different avenues and you keep on changing your political decision makers, this is a problem. And so we rather not get involved in it. The major goal would then be to ensure that deaf are involved and that Libras is actually recognized. The deaf community should benefit at the end of the day. Leona speaking. Thank you very much, Ronice. We have another person raising their hand, and it's Jana again. I'm going to be signing in DGS.
So what has been mentioned pertaining to the deaf community and deaf individuals, we recognize, right, as you mentioned, they're often lumped in as part of a disability. And often deaf individuals themselves much more identify as linguistic minority. And you in Brazil have this beautifully established, where here in Germany, we're still seeing deaf individuals as part of the disability group, right? And the whole concept behind that is it's to do with trying to move things forward. But really what we're seeing is that no, in fact, it should be deaf individuals are maybe would do better as their language recognized. So my question to you is how we could escape this disability rhetoric and move into linguistic recognition.
Great, thank you so much for your question. This is not an easy process. I really just want to let you know that for educational purposes, it is. I think it is very clear that for educational purposes, we do not need to look at the disability label. It's a different system altogether. This must be a very clear concept that we engage with. For example, in the deaf community, we have a deaf consortium, which is FACES. And as I've said previously, they have advocated for various access as part of a disability group, because there's been many societal places where, I mean, there was just inaccessibility. So on the educational path, this is a very different view. In Brazil, we have very clear lines of definition. The provision of an education for deaf learners and also for deaf blind people is equal, it's the same thing. Deaf blind people also then need to organize themselves to make sure that they do get a quality education, to make sure that they progress. And so it's not the same as the disability label or the disability sector. Education, for example, when you put them into mainstream, a mainstream environment, it's very difficult. And we need to understand that the inclusion in society means that there must be inclusion for deaf learners. It's not only for deaf people. I don't need to explain this to you, very much aware of what it is. I think we need to drop the discussion on education as disability, with the disability lens. I think we need to focus on ensuring that, for example, in Brazil, we do have indigenous languages. And so the indigenous languages ensure that we do have bilingual education. And so throughout Brazil, especially on the south side, where they speak Spanish, for example, in those countries, they do have bilingual education. And this is the same for deaf students. Deaf learners must have access to bilingual education because we're recognizing spoken languages as bilingual education. And so throughout the diversity of spoken languages, we need to see the development for other languages, but also for Libras, and equal participation and equal recognition for deaf people and deaf learners. We cannot have the disability label attached to deaf education because the issue is about language and being a linguistic minority. So this is the important aspect that we need to focus on. The government think that, oh, well, it's okay, you can just get interpreters into the education sector and give them access to language. This is not the case. We are advocating strongly for bilingual education to ensure that there's full participation of deaf learners. If there is a hearing school, 50% hearing learners and deaf learners in the same school, then we can make a case to have bilingual education in a school for a mainstream process. But we cannot have this if the number of deaf learners exceeds the number of hearing learners. And so I think bilingual education is imperative, and it is a must for all deaf learners to ensure equal access. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ronice. Is there anyone else who has a question? We still have some time left. I think that was the last question, but we do still have time for at least one more, if there are any burning questions out there in the audience. Okay. Maybe everyone's starting to fall asleep. It's getting to that point in the evening. It's dinner time, I think. Ronice is saying, thank you all very, very much for this opportunity. Your questions were delightful. I really enjoyed them. And I think it's the beginning of a fascinating conversation, taking a look at Germany and Brazil. And I hope it's one we can continue. Leona, yes, thank you so much. Thank you for accepting to come and present to us. It's a phenomenal program, and hopefully this is something we can learn from. The Brazilian experience, I think, is something we can take away and hopefully apply here, because we have many states as you do in Brazil. Thank you very much, Ronice. Thank you. Thank you to both the DGS and the IS to English interpreters. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.